You wake up and something feels different. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. You go through your routine. You answer messages. You complete tasks. From the outside, nothing dramatic has changed. But internally, there's distance. You don't fully relate to the version of yourself you used to be. The things that once defined you feel muted. The reactions that once felt automatic now feel slower. You look at your own life and think, why don't I feel like myself anymore? And that question is unsettling, because identity has always been your anchor. You knew who you were, what you valued, how you reacted, what you wanted. Now, those edges feel softer. You are not in crisis. You are not collapsing, but you are undefined. This is a stage most people misinterpret as being lost. But often, you are not lost. You are between identities. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the tension that appears when the ego begins separating from outdated identifications. He believed that much of what we call identity is actually identification, attachment to roles, traits, and narratives that once helped us adapt. But adaptation is not the same as wholeness. The persona you built, the competent one, the strong one, the agreeable one, the ambitious one, served a purpose. It helped you function, belong, succeed. But individuation requires something more. It requires that the ego gradually loosen its grip on what no longer reflects the deeper self. And when that loosening begins, you feel disoriented because the old identity is fading, but the new one has not stabilized. This creates psychological ambiguity. You may notice this in subtle behaviors. You hesitate before responding in ways that once felt automatic. You question opinions that once felt solid. You feel less reactive, but also less defined. Earlier, someone could describe you easily. Driven, outgoing, reliable, strong. Now, those labels feel incomplete, not false, incomplete. And incompleteness feels unstable. Jung described this phase as a necessary destabilization of the ego. He believed that when the ego over-identifies with a fixed self-image, growth requires temporary disorientation. The old structure must loosen before a broader identity can form. But loosening feels like loss. You may feel less certain in social situations, less attached to the persona that once felt natural. You may even feel like you're performing an outdated role, like wearing clothes that once fit, but now feel tight, not unbearable, just constricting. This is where fear enters. If I'm not who I was, then who am I? The ego dislikes undefined states. It prefers clarity. It wants a stable narrative. I am this kind of person. But when individuation deepens, that sentence becomes harder to finish, because you are no longer confined to one-sided definitions. You may notice increased introspection, more time alone, more reflection, more questioning. Earlier, your energy moved outward, building identity. Now it moves inward, reorganizing it. This inward turn can feel isolating, because you cannot explain it easily. You are not depressed. You are not spiraling, but something inside is shifting. Jung often spoke of symbolic death in psychological development, not literal endings, but the dissolution of outdated self-concepts. When an identity that once felt solid begins to dissolve, the psyche enters what feels like a void. The void is not emptiness. It is potential, but potential feels uncertain. You may look at old photos, old goals, old ambitions, and feel a slight distance, not rejection, just unfamiliarity. You recognize that version of you, but you don't fully inhabit it anymore. And yet, you cannot fully define the new version either. This is the in-between, the transitional space where identity is reorganizing, and transition always feels disorienting. You may also experience reduced emotional intensity, less dramatic highs, less reactive lows. This can feel like numbness at first, but often it is stabilization. When the ego loosens, the exaggerated traits soften. You are not as invested in proving yourself, not as driven by external validation, not as attached to old roles. But without those reinforcements, you feel undefined. Jung believed that the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, is far more complex than the ego's narrow definition. When the ego begins integrating shadow aspects, neglected traits, and previously disowned parts, identity becomes less rigid. Less rigid means less predictable. Less predictable means less certain. And less certain feels like confusion. You may wonder, why can't I just feel like myself again? Because of self, you're referring to a structure around a previous stage of development. You cannot regress into that identity fully. Growth makes that impossible. Even if you try to return, it would feel forced, because awareness has expanded. And expanded awareness cannot shrink back into narrow identification. This stage often appears after significant inner work, after projection awareness, after confronting shadow traits, after recognizing misalignment. The ego no longer fits comfortably in its old container, but the new container is not yet built, so you stand in between, functioning, thinking clearly, but internally reassembling. The mistake is assuming this undefined state means failure. It does not. It means restructuring. When a building is being renovated, there's a period where walls are open and surfaces unfinished. That stage looks incomplete, but it is necessary for reinforcement. Identity renovation feels similar, externally stable, internally exposed. You may feel more sensitive, more reflective, less willing to perform automatically. That does not mean you are lost. It means you are separating from outdated identifications. Jung believed that the separation is painful because the ego equates identity with survival. If the old identity dissolves, the ego fears disappearance. But dissolution is not destruction. It is expansion. You are not losing yourself. You are shedding a version that was once sufficient. And shedding feels unstable before it feels freeing. The question is not, how do I get back to who I was? The more useful question is, what parts of who I was are still true, and what parts have outgrown their function? That question requires patience, because clarity does not arrive instantly. Identity transition unfolds gradually, through small behavioral shifts, through changing values, through quieter reactions, through less attachment to image. You are not lost because you cannot define yourself clearly. You are in transition because definition is expanding, and expansion always feels ambiguous before it stabilizes. Right now, you may not have certainty, but you have awareness. And awareness is the first sign that the old identity has loosened enough for something deeper to form. You are not broken. You are reorganizing. And reorganization always feels undefined before it feels whole. The most unsettling part isn't that you feel different. It's that you can't clearly describe how. If someone asked you, what's changed? You might hesitate. You're still responsible, still capable, still functioning. And yet, something has softened. You don't react the same way. You don't chase the same validation. You don't defend your image as quickly. But without those reactions, who are you? This is where identity transition becomes uncomfortable. Carl Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But he never implied that becoming would feel stable. Becoming requires separation. Separation from outdated identifications. The ego, however, experiences that separation as threat, because the ego is built from identification. I am the ambitious one. I am the strong one. I am the reliable one. I am the agreeable one. When those labels loosen, the ego feels exposed. Earlier, your identity may have been anchored in performance. You knew how to show up, how to respond, how to be perceived. Now, the script feels thinner. You pause more. You question more. You observe yourself more. That observation creates distance between you and your automatic self. And distance feels unfamiliar. You may notice that certain compliments don't land the same way. Being called driven doesn't energize you like it used to. Being seen as strong doesn't define you as completely. It's not rejection. It's detachment. Jung described this stage as a withdrawal projection. Not only projection onto others, but projection onto ourselves. We project fixed identities onto our own personality. We believe we are one-sided. But individuation demands complexity, and complexity destabilizes simplicity. When you integrate shadow traits, vulnerability alongside strength, doubt alongside competence, The old clean labels dissolve. You are no longer purely one thing. And that lack of purity can feel like confusion. There may also be grief here. Grief for clarity. Grief for certainty. Earlier, you could say, "This is who I am," without hesitation. Now, the sentence feels incomplete. But that incompleteness is not regression. It is expansion. Jung believed that psychological growth involves the death of previous self-images. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual disidentification. You are not losing capacity. You are losing rigidity. But rigidity feels safe. It provides definition. So when rigidity softens, you feel unanchored. You may also notice reduced emotional intensity around things that once defined you. Competition may feel less compelling. Approval may feel less urgent. Even conflict may feel less dramatic. This can feel like emptiness at first, because the ego was energized by those dynamics. Without them, there is silence, and silence feels like absence. But silence is space, space for redefinition. This stage often includes a sense of being between social groups. You don't fully relate to the version of yourself that once fit effortlessly, but you also don't yet resonate with something new. You feel slightly outside your own narrative. Jung described this as standing between opposites. The old identity has dissolved enough to create distance. The new identity has not consolidated enough to provide certainty. You are suspended. Suspension feels unstable. You may try to rush the process, to define yourself quickly, adopt new labels, new goals, new aesthetics. But forced identity formation often recreates the same rigidity in a new form. True individuation requires tolerating the undefined state, without panic, without impulsive reinvention. There's something deeply humbling about this stage. You realize how much of your identity was constructed around adaptation. What was rewarded, what was expected, what was safe. Now, as awareness deepens, you see those structures more clearly. And once you see them, you cannot fully unsee them. Returning to unconscious performance feels impossible. But conscious identity is still forming. This is why the feeling is so disorienting. You are no longer who you were, but you cannot yet articulate who you are becoming. Jung warned that the ego often resists this ambiguity by clinging to old patterns. You may feel tempted to reassert your previous identity, to act like yourself again, to perform familiarity, but it feels forced because growth has occurred. You may also notice that you feel more inwardly oriented, more reflective, less reactive, less concerned with maintaining a consistent image. That internal orientation reduces external clarity. From the outside, you may look the same, but inside, structure is shifting. Identity consolidation takes time. The ego must renegotiate its relationship with the self. The persona must adapt to reflect deeper truth. And adaptation at this level cannot be rushed. There's also fear of judgment. If you are changing, will others notice? Will they misunderstand? Will they feel distance? That fear can tempt you to revert. But reversion only postpones integration. Jung believed that failing to answer the call of individuation results in stagnation. Answering it results in temporary disorientation, followed by greater coherence. Right now, you may be in the disorientation phase. And disorientation feels like being lost. But loss implies absence of direction. Between identities implies movement. You are not drifting aimlessly. You are reorganizing. The difference is subtle, but important. You may feel undefined. But undefined does not mean empty. It means unfinalized. And unfinalized identity is not weakness. It is development in progress. The task in this stage is not to define yourself prematurely. It is to observe what feels authentic without forcing it into rigid language. What behaviors feel aligned? What reactions feel proportionate? What values feel stable even when labels dissolve? These are the early markers of the emerging identity, not dramatic reinvention. Subtle congruence. The old self is fading. The new self is not yet solid. And you are standing in the space between. Uncomfortable, uncertain, but evolving. This is not being lost. This is ego restructuring. And restructuring always feels undefined before it feels whole. The instinct right now is to define yourself, to settle the uncertainty, to say, this is who I am now, and feel stable again. But premature definition creates premature rigidity, and rigidity is what you just outgrew. Carl Jung emphasized that psychological transformation is not linear. He described individuation as a spiral process, where old structures dissolve, tension increases, and only then does a more integrated identity form. If you try to skip the tension, you interrupt the spiral. Right now, you may feel undefined, but undefined does not mean directionless. It means your identity is reorganizing at a deeper level than labels. You may notice this in small behavioral changes. You no longer react instantly in conflict. You don't defend yourself as aggressively. You don't overexplain your choices. You don't feel as compelled to perform your personality. Earlier, your identity may have been reinforced by strong reactions, strong ambition, strong certainty, strong positioning. Now, those edges are softer, and softness can feel like weakness if you're used to sharp definition. But often, softness signals integration. You are less one-sided, less exaggerated, less dependent on rigid traits. Jung warned that over-identification with a single trait creates imbalance. The strong one represses vulnerability. The rational one represses emotion. The independent one represses need. Individuation integrates opposites. Integration dissolves clean labels. And when labels dissolve, identity feels blurred. You may find yourself saying, I don't know what I want. But perhaps it's more accurate to say, what I used to want no longer fits. There's a difference. The ego interprets ambiguity as failure, but the psyche interprets it as transition. There's also a practical discipline required in this phase. Resist the urge to panic change your life. You don't need to quit everything. Reinvent everything. Rebrand yourself socially. You need observation. Watch what feels aligned in small moments. Notice which conversations energize you now. Notice which environments feel too narrow. Notice which behaviors feel artificial. This data builds a new identity gradually. Jung believed that the self reveals itself indirectly, not through sudden declarations, but through subtle attractions, recurring interests, persistent tensions. If you pay attention, patterns begin to emerge. You may notice that depth matters more than performance. Meaning matters more than momentum. Integrity matters more than image. These shifts are quiet, but they are foundational. Another important realization: you are not obligated to feel fully formed at all times. The modern world pressures you to present a fixed identity, a clear brand, a clear path, a clear personality. But psychologically, identity is dynamic. Jung understood that development requires periodic disorientation. Without disorientation, there is no expansion. Think about adolescence. Identity felt unstable, fluid, exploratory. This stage is similar, but more conscious. You are not regressing. You are refining. You may also notice increased sensitivity to hypocrisy, to incongruence, to performative behavior, including your own. That sensitivity is awareness sharpening. But awareness makes old patterns feel uncomfortable. You can no longer move unconsciously in the same way. And that loss of unconscious ease feels like instability. There is also humility in this phase. You may realize you don't have all the answers. You may feel less certain in your opinions, less attached to being right. That can feel like losing strength. But Jung would argue that it is the ego relinquishing inflation. Inflation creates confidence without depth. Integration creates quiet certainty without rigidity. You are moving toward the latter, but the transition requires patience. Here is the practical approach. Do not define yourself by what is dissolving. Define yourself by what remains consistent beneath the dissolution. What values still feel true? What behaviors feel aligned? What reactions feel proportionate? Identity consolidation does not happen through dramatic insight. It happens through repeated congruence. You try something. You observe how it feels. You adjust. Over time, coherence returns. But it returns broader, less fragile, less dependent on performance. Jung wrote that the self is not something we invent, but something we discover. Discovery requires uncertainty. If you already knew exactly who you were becoming, you would not need transition. This undefined stage is not emptiness. It is construction, invisible construction. The old structure has been partially dismantled. The new structure is being assembled quietly. From the outside, nothing looks different. Internally, everything is reorganizing. You are not failing to define yourself. You are refusing to define yourself prematurely. That restraint is maturity. The discomfort you feel is the cost of not regressing into an outdated identity. And that cost is temporary. Over time, patterns stabilize. You speak differently, choose differently, engage differently, without dramatic announcement. You simply feel more coherent. The in-between will not last forever, but it cannot be rushed. If you stay present, if you observe without panic, identity will reassemble at a higher level of integration, not narrower, broader, not louder, more grounded. You are not lost. You are reorganizing. And reorganization always feels unstable before it feels whole. If you no longer feel like your old self, do not assume something has gone wrong. The old self may have served its purpose, and now it is loosening. Carl Jung understood that individuation requires the dissolution of outdated identifications. That dissolution feels like confusion, because clarity disappears before coherence returns. You are not empty. You are unfinalized. An unfinalized identity is a sign of growth. You are between structures, between definitions, between narratives. That space feels unstable, but it is creative. If you resist it, you regress. If you endure it consciously, you expand. You do not need to force clarity. You need to tolerate ambiguity, because from ambiguity, a more integrated identity forms. You are not lost. You are between identities. And that in-between space is where real psychological maturity is built. Conclusion. Here's a refined, deeper closing conclusion for Video 72, aligned with Jung's framework and the tone of inner shadow signal. Conclusion. The space between is sacred. If you no longer feel like the person you used to be, don't rush to fix it, and don't rush to redefine yourself. Carl Jung understood something most people resist. Identity must dissolve before it expands. The ego cannot grow without first loosening its grip on who it thought it was. That loosening feels like disorientation. It feels like not recognizing yourself fully. It feels like standing in a space without clear labels. But that space is not emptiness. It is transition. You are not lost. You are between forms, between identities, between chapters. The version of you that once felt solid was built for a previous stage of life. It carried you where you needed to go. But individuation demands movement beyond fixed definitions. And movement always disrupts certainty. You may miss the clarity of your old identity, the sharp edges, the predictable reactions, the familiar roles. But growth requires complexity. And complexity feels unstable before it feels whole. Jung believed that the self is larger than any identity the ego can construct. When the ego begins surrendering rigid identification, the psyche reorganizes at a deeper level. That reorganization is quiet, invisible, and temporarily confusing. But it is not regression. It is maturation. You do not need to force a new version of yourself into existence. You do not need a dramatic reinvention. You need patience, observation, and tolerance for ambiguity. Clarity will return, not as a narrow label, but as coherence. You will not wake up one morning suddenly defined. You will gradually notice that your choices feel more aligned, your reactions more proportionate, your values more stable. And without announcing it, you will realize you are no longer between identities. You have integrated into something broader, something less rigid, something more whole. The in-between is not a mistake. It is a sacred psychological space. And if you allow it to unfold without panic, it will shape you into someone more integrated than the person you were before. You are not lost. You are becoming.